Hello and welcome. I'm doing something a little bit different today. I'm trying a spot of direct watercolour painting. Have you ever done that before? Maybe you haven't heard of this term before, but what I mean is I'm painting with no underdrawing. So I normally begin with a pencil sketch, which I do right onto my watercolour paper, and I'll pop a card in the top right corner and you can see a whole playlist of me creating paintings in that way, because that's my usual approach. But every so often it's nice to try something a little bit different. Now, how you start a painting is really quite an important thing to get your head around, because starting anything is always the hardest part. And I've been thinking a bit about underdrawings and whether you really need them or not. And I've written a detailed blog post all about that, and I will pop the links to that article in the description below. And as you can see, obviously, from the painting that I am doing, you don't have to do an underdrawing, but you might want an underdrawing, because when you start a painting, what you're faced with is a blank page. And any artist of any level will tell you that one of the most terrifying things to face is, in fact, that blank page. So there's no harm in starting with an underdrawing, and there's lots of different ways to go about it. And what I'm doing today is another option again, which is to avoid the drawing process altogether, and essentially you just draw with the paintbrush. Now, when I started, I began with clean, dry paper. And when you paint with watercolour onto dry paper, that is when you're going to have the most control. The watercolour paint won't wildly whoosh across the page or do any of those unpredictable things that personally I love, but those things aren't going to happen when the paper is dry. So in the beginning it's not too bad. You start with your lightest colours and you slowly and thoughtfully start placing in your light shapes. And then, of course, once you've done that for a bit, you have less and less dry paper to work with, and you are probably going to want to go back into the areas you've already painted, which are no longer dry, which means when that happens, you are going to have the paint mixing of its own accord, making those amazing watercolour effects. So in the beginning on dry paper, it's a little bit less terrifying, and then as time goes on, there's more chance of these glorious watercolour effects appearing, whether you plan them or not. And personally, I'd be very disappointed if I painted a boring old bunch of grapes that looked exactly like a bunch of grapes. If I want a very realistic representation, I would just take a photograph, to be honest. So I love when the water and the paint mixes together and kind of distorts the image a little bit. That makes me very, very happy. And what you can see in those grapes there is, in some places where I've touched perhaps a purple into the light yellowy greens, some blending has occurred. And that's really quite a lovely effect, I think, because some of it looks like the shadows from one grape to another. It gives you some of the definition on those circular shapes, but it's not perfect circles. It's not like a cartoon image where every little grape is a perfect round ball. And I'm moving away from the grapes there at the moment, and I've put in a leaf. I think I probably put in a leaf that was way too big, but let's not worry too much about that right now. And I'm doing something else that might seem a little unconventional. I'm painting with the back of the brush. Yes, the handle. I'm not really painting. I'm using the pointy, sharp tip of the back of the brush to scratch some marks into that leaf shape, because what I'm thinking about is the veins that I can see on some of the images that I'm looking at when I'm painting this bunch of grapes. And when you do that, what you're really doing is actually damaging the paper a bit. You are pushing that tip of the back of the paintbrush into the paper and creating a groove. So the watercolour paint, when it's still wet, runs into that groove and pools there, making quite a deep, dark line. So it will leave a line and you probably won't be able to move that line, but it's kind of just what I'm after here, because I am, as I say, thinking about those veins in the leaves, and I'm using those marks to paint them. Now, I think at about this point I started worrying about the relative proportion of my leaf there, so I got a bit distracted by that, but I am still trying to drop in some different colours, some darker greens, to add some more interest and dimension to those leaves. Because one of the things I love about these grapes hanging from the vines in their bunches is all the light and shadow on each of the individual grapes, and the way the light falls on the leaves and the way the leaves overlap. And because I'm painting that leaf very close to the bunch of grapes, and it's all still damp, you can see that some of the paint has whooshed across from the leaf into the grape. Now, I actually love that, but it's the sort of thing that you might find mildly alarming if you are used to a little bit more of an illustrative approach and carefully trying to reproduce your subject matter. And actually, on the issue of subject matter, I should say that grapes are something that I have painted before, and quite a few times. It's a bit of a favourite painting subject, and that does make this direct painting a bit easier for me. And if you're going to give it a go and you've never done it before, this is quite an important suggestion, I think, is that you go for something that you're quite used to drawing and painting, so that you kind of set yourself up for success, because it is a lot of fun, but you don't want to be disappointed with what you're doing. So make it a little bit easier for yourself by choosing a subject that you're quite familiar with, or at least have a few little practice sketches, or maybe a little bit of painting in your sketchbook of the particular subject before you do the direct painting. But the other thing is, painting should just be fun, and we shouldn't make too much of it. If the painting doesn't turn out well, it doesn't really matter. What's important is that you got out your paints and you had a marvellous time splashing the paint around and relaxed a bit and kind of forgot about whatever else was going on in your day. Now, I'm painting a few extra leaves at the top, and what I'm doing is letting my lovely brush do a fair bit of the work for me. I keep moving the angle of the brush and letting that pointed tip create some of those jagged edges that you see on vine leaves. And I also try to vary the paint. You can see I don't do a lot of paint mixing, colour mixing on the palette. I like the paints to kind of mix and mingle on their own on the paper. And I do prefer to sort of drop in an extra colour onto a wet area, rather than pre-mixing it and putting down a solid pre-mixed colour, if you see what I mean. Now, I've put in most of the main subject matter, but I don't really want to leave that background blank. So I am using the same colours that I've already been painting with, and I'm letting a light wash of some of those colours drop in. And every so often, sometimes it's accidental and sometimes it's on purpose, I will let my wet brush touch some of the main subject, and you can see that happened with that grape on the left hand side, and then a little blast of colour kind of spills out into this background wash, and I love that sort of thing. That's, my idea of happiness, is to watch those colours spill out in those lovely organic shapes across the washes. Once you know why that happens and when it happens, it's all to do with the dampness of the paper and the dampness of the paint, as I've been saying. But once you know why it happens, you can decide whether to allow it to happen or whether to try and avoid it. Of course, my advice is going to be to go with the flow and let the paint do what it will. I've chosen to leave this video in real time today because I wanted to show you that it really is possible to sit down and do a little painting in under 20 minutes, because I would love it if it inspired you to take up a paintbrush and give it a go. Watercolor really is so approachable in that way. I mean, in under 20 minutes you can set up for painting, complete your little painting and do the tidying up, because let's face it, when it comes to watercolor, all you've got to do is rinse out the brush and flip over the lid on your palette and you're done. One of the things I would really like to be able to do on my channel is to encourage any would-be painters to actually start painting, because the world is a much happier place if anybody who has the slightest inclination to do some creating actually gets out their supplies and does so. And so hopefully today we've talked about some of the things that might hold back a reluctant painter. Certainly not the setup time. You don't have to worry about whether you can do a pencil drawing or whether you should or whether you shouldn't. Remember, there are no rules, you get to make them up for yourself. You don't even have to worry about whether your painting subject actually turns out looking exactly like your painting subject. Well, not in my opinion anyway. You'll have to make up your own mind. But there is a lot of satisfaction to be had just in celebrating the things that you enjoy about a particular subject. In my case, for these grapes, I love their round shapes, I love the different colours, and I love the way the light falls across the grapes and the leaves. So if I can capture some of that, or even if I don't, I'm happy if I've spent some time thinking about those beautiful things that seem to make my heart so happy. And I'm sort of reaching the point in this painting right now where I should probably stop. I did say earlier that the hardest part of starting anything was actually the beginning. I think the second hardest part is knowing when to stop. So what I tend to do is use largely one brush for the whole painting. But when I get near to the end, sometimes I want to add in a few finer details. So occasionally I will swap over to a smaller brush, and you can see I'm touching the paper with my finger there because I'm just wanting to work out exactly how damp or dry it is. Of course, if it's dry, then the dark colour that I put in is going to stay put. If it was wet, that dark colour would spread out into the wet area and I would lose some of my lights. So I'm now beginning what is slightly dangerous, I think, because it is what I call fiddling. A little is good because it's the odd little detail that can really bring the subject to life. But you can get carried away, so the hard part is knowing when to stop. And the technique you can see me using there is called softening off. What I'm doing is putting down the dark colour that is defining the edge of some of those grapes, and then on the one edge of it, on the one side of that dark mark that I've put down, I am running my damp brush, which means that the dark mark that I put down is going to soften across into that side. And that is helping me reinforce the round shapes of some of the grapes. I don't want to do it to all of them, and I don't want to do it all the way around, because really what I'm doing is emphasizing the darkest dark. And the thing that makes a sphere look like a sphere on a two-dimensional piece of paper is the way you shade it. So where the light is falling across the top, that's going to be a light edge. So for me, for some of those grapes, it's just the white of the paper or some of those lighter colours that I put on. And because I painted a lot of those grapes together and the paint was still damp, they sort of run together. So this technique is an opportunity for me to suggest some separation between those grapes, to pull one grape forward and let the other recede by adding in a little darker colour there. I do rather enjoy this, so you can see I'm starting to do the technique of adding in the dark and softening off more and more. And if I carried on and did as much of this as I possibly could and did it successfully, you would end up with a far more realistic painting. And that's really the next important question, is when to stop. Because if you keep going from your abstract shapes and adding in the details, you'll end up with a more realistic image. And that's, as I said at the very start, really not what I'm going for. So I've sort of reached the point where I'm rather wishing that there was somebody to come in with a firm hand and insist that I stop painting and put my paintbrush down immediately. But what can you do? If you've enjoyed this painting video, please consider giving it a like. And of course, if you want to see some more, how about hitting that subscribe button and turning on the notification bell? I'd love you to join me the next time I decide to do some painting. Even better, I'd love it if you painted along with me. And if you are one of those reluctant painters I was talking about earlier, please let me know in the comments what is the biggest thing that holds you back. I'd love to be able to help with that too. See you again next time. Thanks for watching. Happy painting.